I tried to do something generous, and now I'm being sued for it. Yes, you read that right. I rented my house to an entitled family at way below market rent to help them out, and when I finally had to sell the property, they slapped me with a lawsuit. This whole situation feels like a fever dream, but I promise it's all too real. A bit of background. I, 35M, inherited a small single-family house from my late grandmother a few years ago. It was in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy, but it was a solid starter home. At the time, I already had my own place, so I figured I'd rent Grandma's house out. I didn't need the extra income immediately, and I liked the idea of helping someone who might be struggling with high rent prices. So, when a friend of a friend told me about a family looking for an affordable place, I thought, why not give them a break? Instead of charging the full market rate, I offered them a rent significantly below what I could have asked. I know I probably sound naive already, but I genuinely wanted to pay it forward. Enter the tenants, a family of 4. I'll call them the Smiths, not their real name. There was the dad, John, the mom, Jane, and their 2 kids, who were around 8 and 10 years old. When I first met them, they seemed like nice, decent folks down on their luck. John had recently lost his job and was working odd jobs, and Jane was a stay-at-home mom trying to get back into the workforce. They had been priced out of their previous rental and were living with Jane's sister, all 4 of them crammed in one room. It tugged at my heartstrings. I figured, hey, I've got this empty house, and they're a family in need. It's a win-win if I rent it to them for cheap. They were overjoyed when I agreed to rent to them at about 25% below the going rate in that area. Looking back, that was my first mistake, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do. For the first few months, everything was great. The Smiths paid their rent on time, at least at first, and they sent me polite texts about minor maintenance issues. I felt vindicated in my decision to help them. I even did a few extra things pro bono. I replaced an old dishwasher for them and let them paint the kids' rooms their favorite colors, with the agreement they'd repaint when they moved out. I wasn't some big-shot landlord, just a guy with one extra house, so I treated them like neighbors rather than tenants. We were on a standard 1-year lease, which they signed without any fuss. I figured if all went well, I wouldn't mind letting them stay for years. It was after that honeymoon period that little signs of entitlement began to show. One time, a few months in, John texted me saying money was tight and asked if they could pay rent a couple of weeks late. They had been good so far, and I wanted to be understanding, so I said sure, just this once. They eventually paid, but I had to remind them twice. Another time, I found out they had adopted a large dog without even asking me. I had no problem with pets in principle, but our lease had a clause requiring approval for any pets and an additional deposit. When I brought it up, Jane brushed it off like, oh, we thought you'd be okay with it since you're so cool about stuff. I bit my tongue and even waived the pet deposit to keep things friendly. I know some of you are shaking your heads at me. Trust me, I'm shaking my own head looking back too. Despite these minor issues, I still thought things were manageable. The year lease came and went. They wanted to renew, and I figured I'd let it roll over into a month-to-month arrangement at the same rent. I know. Second mistake. I just didn't have the heart to hike up their rent when I knew they were struggling, and frankly, I was busy with my own life and job. John had found a steadier job by then, though not high-paying, and Jane was doing some part-time work. They could have afforded a bit more by that point, but I didn't push it. We never signed a new lease. It just continued unofficially under the same terms. That detail will become very important later. Fast forward to earlier this year. Life threw me a curveball. I lost my job when the company I worked for went under unexpectedly. Suddenly, I had a hefty mortgage on my primary residence to pay, and no income. I picked up some freelance work and a part-time gig, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover all my expenses. I had savings, but with a potential recession looming and job prospects looking grim, I had to make some hard decisions. One obvious option was to sell the rental house. It wasn't something I wanted to do. I knew it would uproot the Smiths, but financially it made the most sense. That house was fully paid off, thanks to Grandma, and selling it would give me a significant cushion to survive on while I got back on my feet. It could potentially clear my own mortgage and keep me afloat. I agonized over how to break the news to the Smiths. I knew this would hit them hard. They'd been living there for about 3 years at this point, and had sort of treated the place like it was theirs. I finally mustered the courage and told them in person. I went over one afternoon, sat them down at the kitchen table, and explained my situation. I was honest about losing my job and the financial strain I was under. I even offered them a couple of options. If they could somehow secure financing, I'd be willing to sell the house to them directly at a slight discount. Given the below-market rent, maybe they'd had a chance to save some money wishful thinking, it turns out. Alternatively, I promised to give them plenty of time, more than the legal requirement, to find a new place. I was thinking of giving them 90 days' notice, even though the law in our state only required 60 for a month-to-month tenancy. I also offered to provide a positive reference to any future landlord, and even offered to help with moving costs out of my own pocket. Basically, I was bending over backwards to make this as painless as possible. Their response was not what I hoped. At first, there was shock and pleading. Jane teared up immediately, talking about how their kids were in the local school, and how uprooting now would be devastating. John was more reserved initially, asking if there was any way I could hold off on selling, or maybe just increase the rent a bit, instead of selling the house outright. He argued that with his new job they could perhaps afford a little more each month. Though to be honest, even market rent in that area was way above what his new salary could cover, so that wouldn't solve my immediate financial crunch anyway. I sympathized, I really did, but I'd run the numbers, and I needed the lump sum from selling. A slight rent bump wouldn't save me from potential foreclosure on my own home if I stayed unemployed for too long. When it became clear that I was set on selling, the mood shifted. John's tone hardened, and Jane's tears turned to anger. They started saying things like, "I thought you were different, not like those greedy landlords who only care about money." That stung, considering how generous I'd been with rent and lenient with late payments and pets. Jane pointed out how much they had made it their home. The kids' hand-painted murals on the bedroom walls, the vegetable garden they'd planted in the backyard, the little improvements they said they'd done. Honestly, most of those improvements were things like shelves in the garage. Useful, sure, but I allowed it all. She said, "Our blood, sweat, and tears are in this house. How can you just sell it from under us?" The guilt was piling on me, even though I felt I was doing what I had to. I reiterated that this wasn't personal or out of greed. I was literally in a financial emergency. I brought up the possibility of them buying the house again, even though I knew it was a long shot. "What about the option of you guys buying it?" "I meant it when I said I'd knock the price down a bit for you," I offered. John just laughed bitterly, saying something like, "With what money? We can barely scrape together rent. You really think a bank will give us a mortgage?" He had a point. Apparently, they hadn't saved anything during the time they'd been renting from me at a discount. I had hoped the lower rent would help them get on their feet, but it seemed they were living pretty much paycheck to paycheck, even with my generosity. Our meeting ended with no real resolution. There was a lot of yelling, mostly from Jane, and tense silence from John. I left their place feeling like absolute crap, but still convinced I had no other choice. To make matters even more awkward, the mutual friend who introduced the Smiths to me, let's call her Amy, called me that evening. Apparently, the Smiths had reached out to her in tears, claiming I was unfairly kicking them out with nowhere to go. Amy felt torn and asked if I could please reconsider or give them a bit more time. I had to explain my side of the story, how I'd lost my job and already given more notice than required, and even offered to help them in every way I could. She listened and said she understood I was in a tough spot, but I could tell she was upset. It was an incredibly tense call. Amy had been the one to vouch for this family, and now she felt stuck in the middle. By the end of it, she just sighed and said she wished things didn't have to be this way. I agreed. That night, I felt even more like the bad guy, but I knew I wasn't doing this out of malice. I genuinely had no other choice. The next day, I sent a formal written notice giving them 90 days to vacate, along with a heartfelt letter reiterating my apologies and willingness to help with references or moving costs. I also officially put the house on the market. I tried to time it so that we'd close the sale after the 90-day period, assuming they'd be gone by then. Well, you know what they say about assumptions. Once the for sale sign went up, the Smiths went from simply upset to actively sabotaging. I had arranged with them as part of the notice agreement to show the house to potential buyers a few times a week, with proper 24-hour notices given each time. Legally, they were supposed to allow it. In reality, it was a nightmare. One Saturday, my real estate agent had scheduled an open house. I reminded the Smiths 2 days in advance, and they said they'd be out of the house during that window. When we arrived with interested couples, we found John sitting on the couch in a stained undershirt, blasting heavy metal music on the speakers. The place was a mess, clothes and toys everywhere, an overflowing trash bin in the kitchen giving off a smell. My agent did her best to smile through it, but the viewers were clearly put off. And John, oh boy, he didn't keep quiet. He greeted every couple who walked in with, "Welcome. Feel free to look around my home. I'm not going anywhere, by the way." I was mortified. I pulled him aside and hissed that this was not okay, but he just shrugged. "You want to sell this place? Fine. But I'm not going to lie to people. They deserve to know this house has occupants." Technically, not a lie. But he knew exactly what he was doing. After that disaster, very few buyers were willing to make an offer. The ones who did made lowball offers, having seen the chaos or heard through the grapevine that the tenants might be a problem. I was stuck. The clock was ticking on my finances, and I had a feeling the Smiths were not going to leave peacefully when the 90 days were up. Eventually, I got an offer from a local real estate investor. It was below the market value of the house, but he explicitly said he'd take the property as is with the tenants still in it. Basically, he had experience with evictions and troublesome tenants and was factoring that headache into his price. His offer would still cover my mortgage and give me a bit of breathing room, though not as much as I'd hoped if I'd gotten a market rate sale in a perfect scenario. Feeling cornered, I accepted his offer. At least it was a sure thing, and I could move on, or so I thought. As the closing date with the investor-buyer approached, the Smiths still hadn't budged. We were now at the end of the 90 days, and sure enough, they told me point blank they weren't leaving. I had no choice but to start the formal eviction process through the courts, which could take weeks or months. The investor buyer was getting antsy, and I was terrified I'd lose the sale and be back to square one. That stress alone was bad enough, but then the Smiths decided to take it up a notch. About a week after I filed for the eviction, I got a knock on my door, a process server handing me a thick stack of papers. The Smiths were suing me. The lawsuit claimed that I had violated their tenant rights and wrongfully attempted to evict them. They argued that I didn't give proper notice, complete BS, I gave more than required, and that I had caused them severe emotional distress by trying to force them out in the middle of the school year. They even alleged that I sold the house below market value out of spite to get rid of them, which makes no sense. I sold to an investor at a discount because no one else would buy under those conditions. There were accusations that I harassed them with the showings and open house, claims that I tricked them into a month-to-month agreement just to pull the rug out from under them, and a demand for damages. They wanted money for their relocation costs, the difference in rent they'd have to pay elsewhere, and some nebulous compensation for pain and suffering. It was a 15-page complaint that read like a greatest hits of everything that can go wrong as a landlord. I was stunned. I wish I could say I laughed it off because their case was clearly bogus, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a wave of panic and nausea. This was now more than just a nasty tenant situation. It was a full-blown legal battle. I spent that night frantically reading over the lawsuit, Googling tenant laws, and trying to get a hold of the lawyer who helped with my grandmother's estate. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking on the closing with the investor, who understandably didn't want to get entangled in a lawsuit. I had no idea what to do, and the stress was consuming me. I posted this story initially to vent and get some perspective on how this could even be happening. To be continued. Update 1. Well, I wish I had better news, but this saga has only gotten worse. It's been about a month since I first posted, and the situation has somehow managed to escalate even further. Buckle up, because there's a lot to cover. First off, the real estate investor who had agreed to buy the house got cold feet. As soon as he learned about the pending lawsuit, he pulled out of the deal. I can't really blame him. Who would voluntarily step into a legal quagmire like this? He was polite about it and said he'd consider re-engaging once the quote-quote-quote tenant issue was resolved. But for now, the sale is off the table. That was a devastating blow. I was counting on that sale money to stay afloat financially, and without it, I'm back to scrambling for ways to pay my own mortgage. I'm burning through my savings just to make ends meet. So as of now, I still own the house, I still have the Smiths living there, rent-free at this point, I'll get to that, and I also have a lawsuit hanging over my head. On the legal front, I've lawyered up. The attorney who handled my grandmother's estate put me in touch with a good landlord-tenant lawyer, and I scraped together the retainer to get him on the case. My lawyer is frankly appalled by the Smiths' lawsuit. He told me that while their claims are exaggerated and largely baseless, we still have to go through the proper legal process to get it thrown out. That means filing responses, attending court hearings, possibly even a trial, all of which equals more time and more money. We filed a formal response denying all their allegations. My lawyer also filed a motion to expedite the eviction case given my financial hardship, but the court system moves at the speed of molasses. Our first court date for the lawsuit isn't for another 2 months. And the eviction hearing we initiated got postponed because the Smiths lawyer, yep, they lawyered up too, probably through some tenant advocacy group or legal aid, managed to get the cases combined. Now everything is one big tangled legal case to be sorted out down the line. In the meantime, the Smiths are still living in my house. Speaking of which, the Smiths have effectively stopped paying rent. After I served them the notice to vacate, they didn't pay for the last month of that period. And once the notice expired and I filed eviction, they decided there's no point in paying anymore, since we're embroiled in this legal fight. My lawyer actually advised me not to accept rent from them during the eviction process anyway, as it could undermine the case by implying I agreed to continue their tenancy. So I'm collecting $0 from that property right now, yet the Smiths continue to live there. A free house, courtesy of yours truly. Each month that passes is money out of my pocket for the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, utilities. They even stopped paying the water bill, which is in my name, so I got hit with that too. It's infuriating. Out of sheer desperation, I even tried one more olive branch. Through our lawyers, I offered the Smiths a settlement. I would pay for their moving expenses and forgive any back rent, basically letting them live free for the last few months, if they would just agree to leave peacefully and drop the lawsuit. Essentially, a cash-for-keys deal, plus a clean slate. It felt galling to even consider paying them after all this, but I needed to stop the bleeding. They responded with a flat nope. Actually, their lawyer sent back a letter saying they'd only consider vacating if I paid them an absurd amount of money. Think tens of thousands of dollars. It was basically a ransom. Pay this huge sum or they'll stay and keep suing. I refused, of course. I don't have that kind of money, and even if I did, there's a principle at stake. I'm not going to be extorted for doing nothing wrong. Here's a twist I didn't see coming. A bit of digging into the Smiths' past has revealed this isn't their first rodeo. My lawyer helped look up any prior cases involving them, and surprise, surprise, they had a dispute with a previous landlord a few years ago. I managed to get in touch with that ex-landlord. The moment I mentioned the Smiths, he let out a groan. According to him, they pulled something eerily similar. Fell behind on rent, refused to vacate when he tried to end the lease, and threatened legal action claiming the landlord was mistreating them. In that instance, it never went fully to court. They moved out before the trial, but only after he basically paid them to leave, and they left the place in shambles. He ended up with a trashed house and months of lost rent. That landlord advised me to be prepared for the Smiths to drag this out as long as possible. It was perversely validating to know I'm not uniquely cursed, but it also made me even more worried. It seems the Smiths know exactly how to play the system and milk it. On a personal note, the stress is eating me alive. I'm not sleeping well at all. I've had to get on anxiety medication just to cope with everything. My family and friends have been supportive, but there's only so much they can do. Even Amy, the mutual friend who introduced us, called to apologize for ever vouching for them. She's horrified by how the Smiths are behaving. I don't blame her at all, but I could hear the guilt in her voice. My parents, while supportive, also hit me with the "this is why you don't do favors for people" lecture, which I really didn't need to hear on top of everything. I'm avoiding driving by the house, because it raises my blood pressure to see them still living there. A neighbor sent me a photo of the yard recently. Once upon a time, I kept it neatly maintained, but now it's a jungle. Clearly the Smiths aren't bothering with upkeep anymore. It's like they know it's not their house long term, so they just don't care. It's depressing and rage-inducing all at once, and I feel utterly helpless. So here I am, stuck in limbo. Best case scenario, I eventually win the lawsuit, get them evicted, and maybe even get a judgment for the unpaid rent and damages. Not that I expect they'd pay up. Worst case, this drags on for many more months, costing me tens of thousands in legal fees, and maybe even forcing me into serious debt or bankruptcy. I wish I had a triumphant ending or some positive update to share, but right now it's just a waiting game from hell. The first big court hearing is set a couple of months from now, and the uncertainty until then is brutal. It feels like I'm living a nightmare I can't wake up from. I'll update again when there's more news, or if some crazy development happens sooner. At this rate, nothing would surprise me. Thanks to everyone who offered support and legal pointers. I definitely need all the help I can get. Update 2. It's been about 6 more months, and this will likely be my final update on this whole nightmare. A lot has happened, though not with the clean, satisfying resolution I had hoped for. If you were expecting a clear-cut victory or some karmic justice, well, reality isn't that kind. The legal battle finally reached a conclusion, but it was anything but dramatic. Leading up to the court date, the judge strongly encouraged us to try mediation. I was reluctant to give the Smiths anything after all they'd put me through, but my lawyer advised me to consider any settlement that would get them out of my life sooner. The Smiths, for their part, seemed to realize parts of their case were weak. Some of their more outrageous claims got tossed by the judge early on, like the emotional distress, which lacked any evidence. In the end, we reached a settlement that, while infuriating, was the lesser of two evils. They agreed to drop the lawsuit and vacate the house within 30 days, and I agreed not to pursue them for any back rent or damages. I even returned their full security deposit to them as part of the deal, despite everything. In other words, I basically paid them off, in the form of forgiving what they owed me and refunding their deposit, to go away. Swallowing that was bitter as hell, but my lawyer reminded me that trying to get a judgment out of them would likely be a waste. It's doubtful I'd ever collect a dime, and it would just mean more legal fees and time. So I took the deal. True to the agreement, the Smiths did move out about 3 weeks after we settled. But of course, they didn't go quietly. I didn't expect them to leave the place spotless, but I also wasn't prepared for what I found when I finally got my property back. It was a war zone. They had left trash piled in every room, random broken furniture strewn about, and there were holes punched in the drywall in 2 of the bedrooms. The walls were still the bright neon colors they'd let their kids paint, with scribbles and stickers everywhere. Needless to say, they did not repaint anything back to neutral. The carpet in the living room was ruined, looked like a mix of spilled liquids and maybe pet mess. Yes, the dog they weren't supposed to have. The vegetable garden Jane was so proud of? It was now just a patch of overgrown weeds, almost as tall as me. They'd also stripped the house of some fixtures. I found a couple of light fixtures and curtain rods missing. It was basically vandalism, under the guise of, we just didn't have time to clean. I have an album full of photos documenting all this, but in the end, what can I do? Part of our settlement was that we walk away from each other legally. I knew pursuing them for property damage would be throwing good money after bad. They probably don't have the cash, and I'm just drained by this whole ordeal. I spent the next month cleaning and repairing the house, mostly on my own, plus hiring out a few bigger fixes. I had to replace sections of drywall, hire a professional cleaner for the carpets, some of which were beyond saving, and redo the paint completely. It cost me a few more $1,000s and countless hours of my own labor. The silver lining, I guess, is that once I got the place back in decent shape, I managed to sell it. The housing market cooled off since I first listed it, and given the history, I was eager to be done, so I ended up accepting a lower price than I'd wanted. After paying off all the expenses and the lawyer bills, I more or less broke even on the sale. No profit, no windfall, pretty much just wiping the financial slate. 3 years of being a landlord, and all I got was a masterclass in how things can go horribly wrong. As for the Smiths, they packed up and vanished. A neighbor told me they saw them loading a U-Haul and heard they might be moving out of state, but who knows? I have no clue where they went. Part of me worries for whatever poor landlord inherits them next, but I also admit I'm just relieved they're out of my life. I thought about trying to warn any future landlord. Not that I have a way to do that, but ultimately, I just want to wash my hands of the whole thing. People like that tend to bounce around until they've exhausted all their goodwill in a place, and then they move on to the next. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up pulling the same stunt on someone else down the line.